The Mormons had been in Missouri for several years, but there had been growing tensions with them and their neighbors to the point to where in 1838 there was what was called the Mormon-Missouri War, where the Mormons were trying to vote in counties where their neighbors thought they didn't belong, and the neighbors decided to fight back, and there was several skirmishes with casualties on both sides. Joseph Smith and several church leaders were thrown in jail, and the governor of Missouri at one point even issued an executive order that declared that the Mormons were nuisances and must either be exterminated or driven from the state. So Joseph Smith and the other leaders of the church were held in jail for the long winter of 1838 into 1839. The rest of the saints, thousands of them, were scattered across the state of Missouri looking for where to go. They were refugees. They eventually crossed the state, crossed the Mississippi River. The saints arrived in Quincy, Illinois, which is a town along the Mississippi River on the Illinois side. And the citizens of Quincy were willing to host the saints as long as it was necessary, but you can only host refugees for so long before they're able to get on their feet. And that's when Joseph Smith was able to escape jail, and the saints bought a bunch of tracts of land and settled in what was then known as Commerce, a very scenic peninsula along the Mississippi River in Illinois. There were only a few dozen people living in Commerce. The land had gone through several different holds. It was initially, the ancestral lands of several indigenous tribes known as Quashkima. And then it was sold as land to pay off War of 1812 veterans, but no one really wanted to settle there. It was a swamp-infested land with lots of mosquitoes and malaria, and so it was owned by some people at one point as and named Venus, then renamed Commerce, but they could never gain permanent settlement. So by the time the saints arrived and they were looking for a place that they could call their own, the speculators who had bought up all this land decided that this is their chance to get rid of their unwanted tracts. And so the saints were able to start nearly fresh. There were a few holdovers from the previous time, but within months, the saints were the dominant group of people living in this city that was soon renamed Nauvoo. They named it Commerce before the Mormons arrived. It was supposed to be, an economic outpost in America's growing capitalistic empire, as seen in the name Commerce. But when the saints moved in, they infused the city with a spiritual mission. It had a sacralized spirit, a divine orientation, divine priorities. So when they gave it a new name, they gave it a sacred name, Nauvoo, Hebrew for a beautiful place, representing that this was going to be a place for God's elect to flee the wicked world and find refuge. When the Mormons first arrived in Illinois, they were welcomed quite gregariously from both political parties. Illinois was getting over an economic recession, they were anxious for new workers, and both political parties at the time, the Whigs and the Democrats, were vying for state control. And here were thousands of new converts or immigrants who they thought that they could swing future elections. So Illinois politicians tripped over each other trying to court the Mormon vote. And that's what enabled Nauvoo to pass a very generous charter granting them lots of powers and authorities that the state of Illinois would actually come to regret later on. Joseph Smith quickly became the hub of both religious and political worlds in Nauvoo. He was seen as the chosen person, the chosen prophet of God to lead the saints in their new direction. So not only was he the religious prophet, but he also held many of the most important civic titles. He wasn't the first mayor, but he was the second. He was the municipal judge. He became the postmaster. He held all these important decisions because the saints saw him as the nexus of power. And Joseph Smith felt that keeping all the control in himself and maintaining that authority was what was going to bring the stability that the saints had long craved. One of the things that the Nauvoo Charter granted was a militia attached to Nauvoo. Now, theoretically, it was part of the Illinois militia, but it was under the jurisdiction of city leadership, which just so happened to be Joseph Smith. And so to the saints, they saw this as their last bulwark of liberty, their last line of defense. They don't want what happened to them in Missouri to happen again. They are going to defend themselves. To those outside of Nauvoo, of course, this was seen as a large militia, larger than the state-standing militia, that was at the whim of a religious leader, which to them seemed inimical to democracy. Every male between the age 18 and 45 had to enlist in the Nauvoo militia, which meant that at its peak, they probably had somewhere close to 2,000 men fighting, which again would have been larger than Illinois' standing militia at the time. Joseph Smith tried to cultivate a judicial system that first and foremost was going to protect the saints. Their time in Missouri had taught them that they could not trust outsiders to protect them, to protect their rights. They felt the governor, state authorities, the courts, politicians did not listen to their interests. So in Nauvoo, they decided we are going to build a wall that's going to protect us. Not a real wall, but a judicial wall. So anytime Joseph Smith faced legal challenges, attempts to extradite him back to Missouri, they would pass laws that would make it more difficult to arrest Joseph Smith on what they saw as trumped up charges. One of the first things he did when they arrived in Nauvoo was they said, we want to get redress for what Missouri did. Missouri deprived us of our liberties. And so we need to get the federal government to intervene and offer us redress, get us recompense for what Missouri had taken from us. So Joseph Smith and several of his closest followers traveled to Washington, D.C., meet with several politicians, congressmen, senators, even the president. But they quickly learned a hard and cruel lesson in early America, which was the federal government was both not powerful enough and not interested in intervening in local affairs. Everyone they spoke to said, that's a state matter. You need to talk to Missouri about that. Martin Van Buren, the president at the time, famously told Joseph Smith, your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you, for I would lose the vote in Missouri. And Joseph Smith and the Saints took a hard lesson from this, recognizing that we can't rely on the government supporting us at this time. So they decided to take two routes. One, locally, we're going to try to build as much protection for us as possible in the city. And two, we're going to petition to strengthen the federal government to be able to intervene in the affairs of local saints. Yeah, the Saints recognized that if they were going to take advantage of this political climate in which the state was divided between the two parties, they needed to pool their resources together. That they needed to do what we call block voting, where everyone's going to vote en masse. So if you, politicians, want our vote, you need to make promises to us, and then we expect you to fulfill those promises. And one of the most remarkable things about this Nauvoo story is politicians listened. I know it's shocking to hear that politicians are able to go to extreme lengths to get people's votes, but that's what politicians did in Nauvoo, in Illinois. They tripped over each other to try to get the Saints to support them. You would have politicians writing the Saints saying, if you can promise the Mormon vote for us, we will strengthen Nauvoo's habeas corpus powers. And so as the Saints are pooling their votes together to support individual politicians, and politicians are lining up to secure the Mormon vote, everyone outside of Nauvoo is like, hey, what's going on here? This doesn't look like democracy to me. This doesn't look like a separation between church and state. Here you have a religious leader dictating to his followers how to vote. That's a subversion of the individual conscience, and that cannot be stood for here in America. Joseph Smith introduced a number of theological and doctrinal innovations in Nauvoo, both based on their traumatic experiences in Missouri, but also natural culminations of what Mormonism was evolving to by the 1840s. For instance, he introduced a new temple worship process, and they were building this grand new majestic temple on the bluff. He introduced ideas of baptisms for the dead, ways for those who are deceased to gain the ordinances of salvation. And then perhaps most controversially, he introduced the doctrine of plural marriage, in which he believed that men, patterned off of this biblical precedent, could form bonds with multiple women in these interconnected familial networks that are going to transcend death and last for the eternities. This doctrine of polygamy starts out very small, with Joseph Smith only sealed to a handful of women starting in 1841. But by the time he dies several years later, nearly 100 men and women had entered this practice, and the sphere of those who are aware of the details grows increasingly larger. And with that came a number who saw polygamy not as the culmination of Mormonism, but the betrayal of it, and saw Joseph Smith as a fallen prophet as a result. Joseph Smith is driven by two primary anxieties. One, he believes that polygamy is crucial to Mormonism's mission. Two, he knew that details about polygamy spreading to the general public would lead to the demise of the church. Joseph Smith is never able to reconcile those two priorities in his mind. So he would publicly denounce polygamy and say, we're not practicing that depraved practice. While privately, sometimes on the same day, he would be either entering into new polygamous unions himself or officiating polygamous unions for others. Every time that Joseph Smith took a risk in introducing polygamy to someone else, that would widen the circle a little bit and raise the chances that someone who learns about these details is not going to be happy with them. Now, there are several early trials in which some of the details get out, and Joseph Smith is able to squash those rumors and move on without any harm done. But those rumors became increasingly loud and especially trenchant, and the saints were unwilling or unable to just ignore them anymore. And the general public outside of Nauvoo is just lapping up these stories. Aha, they said, this is evidence that the Mormons are the depraved infidels that we have said they were all along. And so this was causing both an internal dissent issue in the church, as well as raising the agitation for external opposition. There were a number of Joseph Smith's closest followers, those who dated back to being church members all the way to the beginning, who said, this is too far, Joseph. We didn't sign up for this. We signed up for the Mormonism of the 1830s. We signed up for the Mormonism that was closer to Christianity, but with added a new prophet, a new scripture. This polygamy business, this is a step too far. And so you end up having this dissenting church inside Nauvoo, those who saw themselves as true Mormons standing up for Mormonism's purity in opposing Joseph Smith. It's impossible to know exactly how Joseph Smith and the first practitioners of polygamy understood the practice, because they were very secretive about the details. They probably destroyed most of the letters and documents related to polygamy. So we can piece together bits and pieces of their ideas. And when I look at those bits and pieces, what becomes clear is they critique a domestic order at the time that they believe had failed. That there was an experiment in a traditional family of just a, husband, wife, children that only resulted in death and depravity, mobility, families breaking apart in this early republic that seems to be spiraling out of control. And what they were looking for was stability, coherency, something that's going to hold everything together in this world of tumult. And this patriarchal marriage, in their term, this Abrahamic covenant that had roots in the Bible, was what was going to offer stability and control in a world that they no longer knew what was happening. And so to them, polygamy was what was going to provide them a cemented sense of being and spirituality that was not just going to survive this life, but transcend into the next one. The accounts we get from women who enter polygamy in Nauvoo are often complicated but poignant. One of my favorite examples of this is Eliza R. Snow, who was sealed to Joseph Smith, this great intellectual thinker of early Mormonism, perhaps the church's greatest hymn writer in the early decades. And she is 40 years old, had never married, And she was introduced to polygamy in Nauvoo. And in her diary, on the day that she sealed to Joseph Smith as a plural wife, she doesn't say, I was married into polygamy that day, because that would, break decorum. But she did say, today I was entered into something so stolid, so solid, so stable, something that compares to the depravity of the world around us. I was introduced to something that's going to help me become a goddess, a queen in God's empire. That's what polygamy offered for many women, at least how those who accepted it saw the practice. This was a chance to join a dynastic order of religious certainty. There were plenty of women who rejected the practice, including several who were attached to prominent families. The daughter of Sidney Rigdon, who was in the first presidency, Joseph Smith's right-hand man, she is proposed to by Joseph Smith to enter polygamy, and she rejects it and ends up losing the faith, driving a wedge between these founding families of Mormonism. There are others who arrive after immigrating from England and within weeks of living in Nauvoo are proposed to by Brigham Young or other apostles and reject the practice and flee Nauvoo and call out this horrible, corrupt practice taking place in the city of the saints. And soon those voices, while at first could just be dismissed as anti-Mormon drivel, are later become so loud and consistent that it draws national attention. The dissidents at first try to reform Mormonism. They believe in the church firmly, and they believe it is as much theirs as it is Joseph Smith. So they plead with Joseph Smith, they plead with other leaders to stop this practice. When that doesn't work, they form their own dissenting church in Nauvoo, believing that we are maintaining the core of the faith, the true values upon which this religion was founded. And when they felt that it was necessary because they needed to get their word out, they decided to start their own newspaper, which they called the Nauvoo Expositor. The Nauvoo Expositor tried to, as the name implies, expose all the things that Joseph Smith was doing: polygamy, theocracy, Joseph Smith's involvement in politics, his intervention in the law. They saw it as their necessary action to preserve both the Mormonism they love, but also fulfill their duties as American citizens. Joseph Smith saw it as a direct threat. He knew the power of the print. He knows what a newspaper or a book or a pamphlet can do. So he gathered the city council and he ordered the city council, as the mayor, you need to declare this newspaper a nuisance and have it destroyed. Those on the city council, including those who are a member of the faith, are like, hold on, Joseph. We have had our own printing press destroyed. That's a radical step. But Joseph and Hiram were adamant. This press is a danger. It is threatening our cohesion in the city, and it needs to be destroyed. And after 4 long meetings, finally the city council relents. They order the Nauvoo Expositor destroyed, which the city does. And it's at that moment that the internal dissenters who saw their press destroyed, who saw their freedom of speech curtailed, joined forces with the external opposition. The dissenters moved down the river to Warsaw, which was the hub of anti-Mormon activity, and said, it is time to take action. And the editor of the Warsaw Signal, the most adamant anti-Mormon in the region, declared, the time for debate is past. Let your next statement be made with powder and ball. So the citizens of Warsaw and neighboring communities, they gather together as a mob, they gather together ammunition, and they get all the resources they need to go to war with the saints. Joseph Smith sees all this organized and he realizes, okay, we've prepared for this, guys. We have a militia. We are ready. So Joseph Smith declares martial law in the city of Nauvoo, does not allow anyone to enter or leave the city, and says that we are forming the barricades. We are not letting anyone disrupt the city of the saints. But those actions, both outside Nauvoo and inside Nauvoo, get so extreme that the governor of the state, Thomas Ford, decides that it's time to step in. And that's when he issues an arrest warrant for Joseph Smith. And after several days of negotiation, Joseph Smith decides that it's probably necessary for him to turn himself into the state. Well, at first Joseph Smith did flee. He and Hiram Smith and several of their closest followers, they got on a boat and they left across the Mississippi River into Iowa Territory, where they believed that they could petition the federal government, try to get more support, do something to save the Saints. But while they were over there, I think Joseph Smith came to his senses, and he probably received some encouragement from other saints saying, "You can't leave us in the midst of this war unattended, without a leader, without a supervisor. You're leaving us like sitting ducks." As at that point that Joseph Smith realizes that the peaceful option is probably the better way. And so he enters into a discussion with Thomas Ford to turn himself in. So Joseph Smith is taken as a prisoner to the county jail, which is found in Carthage. But as held as a prisoner, initially he was arrested for destroying the press. But once he turns himself in, the governor does this trick by dismissing those charges and instead charging him with treason based on his declaration of martial law in the city. And what makes that charge different from all other charges that have been brought against Joseph Smith is that that's a charge that he could not be released on bail, which means he is going to be held in state custody. But even at that point, Nauvoo's neighbors were not satisfied. Joseph Smith held in state custody in a county jail is not enough. They've seen this story before. They know Joseph is going to find some legal loophole, or some politician is going to step in to earn the Mormon vote, or some weak-kneed judge is going to let Joseph Smith off the hook because they're worried about some Mormon insurrection. No, the true justice can only be taken in our own hands. And that's why the citizens of Warsaw gather together. They form a mob. They call themselves the Warsaw Committee of Safety, invoking a name that goes back all the way to the American Revolution of citizens taking liberties in their own hands. And they march on Carthage, and they storm the jail, and they kill Joseph Smith in cold blood. Immediately after Joseph and Hiram were killed, church leaders provided a list of up to 30 names of people that they recognized that were in the mob. Only a year later did the state eventually bring charges against 5 people. They believed that charging the 5 leaders of the mob was the best way to get a conviction. But when that case was brought before a jury, they had a really hard time. And in fact, all 5 were eventually acquitted on the general idea that how can we punish a small group of people who are doing the will of an entire community? Where's the justice in that? So all of them ended up getting off. At first, Thomas Ford, the governor, was terrified that this was going to result in civil war. He encourages church leaders to make a public announcement to the church to not go to war, to stay peaceful, which church leaders do. I think they recognize the writing on the wall. And so Nauvoo, instead of turning into a city dedicated to revenge, they become a city of mourning. And for days and weeks, it's a city that's experiencing a shared trauma, holding a funeral for their fallen prophet and their fallen patriarch, Hiram Smith. At first, they think they can lie low, but just 6 weeks later, there's another election in the county. And those outside of Nauvoo thought, all right, we finally killed Joseph Smith. There goes that political threat. But when Brigham Young steps in and organizes the Mormon vote once again, the neighbors are like, we can't get rid of these guys. We thought that by killing Joseph Smith, we don't have to deal with the Mormons as a political threat anymore. And they realize that only the full evacuation or the extermination of the Mormons is going to be the end of this crisis. After another year of conflict, things once again seem to return to a civil war. In the late summer, early fall of 1845, Brigham Young is leading the Saints in Nauvoo, and a number of anti-Mormons outside of Nauvoo are raising their own militias, and they're squaring off one against each other. And Thomas Ford, the governor, says, all right, enough is enough. And he sets up a committee to decide how do we resolve this Mormon crisis. And this committee gets together, they talk to both sides, and they decide the Mormons have to leave, which results in perhaps one of the most awkward letters any American governor has ever written, with Thomas Ford writing this letter addressed to the Mormons, basically saying, look, we don't have any authority to do this, but we would like for all of you to leave the state. Fortunately for all sides involved, the Saints had already concluded the same thing, and they were already targeting leaving the state the next spring to move out to what was then Mexican territory. The outmigration begins in February of 1846 and takes several months before every single Mormon is kicked out of the city of Nauvoo. When the Mormons were leaving Nauvoo, they viewed the American democratic experiment as a failure. They thought that the American government, maybe divinely initiated at the start, that God had chosen the founders to raise up this new nation. But by 1844, it had gone sour. The American government was not willing to step in and protect the rights of minority groups. The federal government was unwilling to intercede when the state becomes a mob. Democracy was a sham. The only way to preserve their rights is through a more theocratic order, which is why they turn to religious authoritarianism to save them from a fallen democracy. The Mormons are never really consistent in their political ideology. They're often opportunists who are trying to take advantage of their current circumstances. When they settle in what becomes Utah, that was Mexican territory. But just the very next year, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ending the US-Mexican War, places that territory once again in American hands. And Mormons are faced with this dilemma. Do we migrate again? Or do we find a way to live within America? I think most Mormons, deep in their heart, they wanted to be American. They wanted to make it work. And maybe they said, all right, so now we're not in an established state. Maybe we can have a state of our own. And if we form our own state, we can be in control. And then we're not going to have the same problems that we had in Missouri and Illinois. Instead, we can assure that we'll have the religious rights necessary. But as is not surprising, the American government is not too excited about a Mormon-controlled state, especially once Mormons are publicly open about practicing polygamy. When Americans looked at the Mormons out in Utah, they saw polygamists, they saw theocrats, they saw people who are trampling upon the virtues of good American civilization. And so they refused to grant Utah statehood. And Utah remains a territory years after it meets the population quota to become a state. So much so that some scholars have rightfully called the Utah dilemma unpopular sovereignty, because even as there are many politicians arguing that all of the residents of these Western territories should have their own popular sovereignty determining their future and their worth, except the Mormons. We can't trust the Mormons to do that. Instead, the Mormons need to be treated as, peasants that we are going to control. Tensions between Mormons and the United States does not resolve until the 1890s. Finally, after decades of increasing anti-polygamy legislation coming out of Washington, D.C., all the way to the point of disenfranchising the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Only at that point did church leaders realize that, all right, I guess we have to give up polygamy. I guess we have to appear more American. And so Wilford Woodruff, who was the church president in 1890, issues what comes to be known as the Manifesto, publicly denouncing the church's previous practice of polygamy. Now, Mormons still privately practiced polygamy for several decades after this, but at least publicly they said, we're going to embrace the American practice of monogamy. A couple years after that, they dissolved their own political party and they embraced the two-party system, with many Mormons becoming Democrats and many becoming Republicans. And it's only at that point that Mormons have met this barrier, giving up polygamy and giving up theocracy, that Utah is finally granted statehood. And only at that moment could the long and complicated and uneven march toward Mormon assimilation begin. For Mormons to become accepted as American citizens, they had to embrace an American notion of religious liberty that meant you did not have the liberty to practice any religious policy that you might think. Mormons said that polygamy is our liberty. That's our religious liberty. That's a practice. We should be allowed to practice that under the umbrella of religious liberty. But what American government leaders came down to say is that, all right, you have the freedom to believe your religion. That doesn't necessarily mean you have the freedom to practice that religion. And one of the major decisions regarding polygamy made this distinction between religious belief and religious practice. And it wasn't until Mormons themselves embraced that distinction that they were granted status as religious actors in America. In Americans' conception of religious liberty, there is a boundary of what is acceptable. And if your religious practice falls outside of that boundary, you don't have the liberty to practice it.